All right, let's just jump right into it. Today we're taking a look under the hood of the world's second largest economy, because right now it is going through its most significant structural adjustment in decades. We're talking about a state that is systematically rewiring its entire political and economic machinery from the ground up. In this explainer, we're going to break down these massive systemic shifts happening in China, which are all coming to a head in the brand new 15th five-year plan. It's honestly a fascinating transition to watch. We're seeing a pivot away from a debt-fueled infrastructure model straight into one that's hyper-focused on technological sovereignty and absolute centralized control.
Now, to really grasp why this shift is happening, we have to talk about the sheer scale of the hidden debt crisis that's driving it: 120%. That staggering figure right there represents the assets of local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, as a percentage of China's national GDP back in 2020. I mean, to put that into perspective, this off-balance sheet debt has snowballed into one of the most complex, threatening economic challenges Beijing has literally ever faced. We're talking about systemic financial risks on an absolutely massive scale.
So that brings us to the core dilemma we're tackling today. How exactly does the world's largest manufacturing superpower redesign its engine while it's still running? I mean, faced with this massive local debt crisis, ongoing deflationary pressures, and a rapidly shrinking population, Beijing can't exactly just hit the brakes, right? Instead, they're actively restructuring their institutions just to survive these threats and pivot toward what the leadership likes to call high-quality development.
Section 1. China's slowing economic engine.
So these immediate, tangible threats are what's really forcing this historic pivot away from the old growth model. And it starts with demographics. In 2002, China had 10 working-age citizens supporting every single retiree. Fast forward to 2021, and that ratio is completely cut in half, down to just 5 workers. And get this, by 2050, it's projected to drop to just 2 workers per retiree. 2. This isn't some far-off futuristic problem, It is happening right now. The national population actually peaked in 2021, which was 8 years earlier than anyone projected. This severe demographic cliff is exactly why Beijing had to implement its first statutory retirement age increase in over 70 years, rolling out in January 2025.
Now let's talk about the money. Following the big tax reforms in 1994 that centralized revenues, local governments desperately needed a way to fund development. So enter local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. Basically, these are state-owned investment companies that local governments use to bypass central borrowing limits so they can finance infrastructure, usually using land sales as collateral. And for decades, they absolutely fueled the Chinese economic miracle. They transformed cities, they drove massive growth, but today? Well, today they become a massive, massive liability.
Because here's the thing. As the property sector slowed down and land sales plummeted, this entire model just hit a brick wall. The gap in the data is wild. With assets sitting at 120% of GDP and liabilities at 70%, the real red flag is the debt at risk, which stands at a whopping 37%. By early 2026, nearly a third of these LGFDVs were technically insolvent. So to prevent a systemic banking crisis that would have undoubtedly rippled across the entire globe, Beijing had to step in with a massive 12 trillion yuan debt swap package. They are literally swapping out high-interest hidden debt for transparent provincial bonds, essentially just to keep the whole system afloat.
Section 2. Fusing party and state.
To manage these incredibly severe economic imbalances, the leadership is aggressively centralizing power. Case in point, the major legal shift from March 2024. For the first time since 1982, the National People's Congress revised the organic law of a state council. Now, this isn't just some boring bureaucratic housekeeping. This revision formally dismantled the historical boundary between the administrative state and the party. It explicitly subordinates the state council to party leadership, grants it unified control over local administrations, and get this, it even brought the central bank governor directly into the cabinet. They've essentially centralized monetary policy and macroeconomic control under one unified, direct roof.
Section 3. Networked state capitalism.
So what's really interesting is how this political centralization directly mirrors a massive structural evolution in China's corporate landscape. A lot of times, we think of state control as just direct, top-down, total ownership. But the reality on the ground is way more complex. We call this networked state capitalism. Instead of relying purely on administrative monopolies, the state acts almost like a giant institutional investor through these really complex indirect equity networks. They're engineering these mixed ownership structures to basically fuse the operational efficiency and innovation of private firms with the deep pockets and political backing of the state.
You can actually trace this exact shift through the data. Based on a massive mapping of corporate ties from 1999 to 2017, the capital controlled by 100% state-owned firms actually dropped from 41% down to 25%. Sounds like they're stepping back, right? Well, actually scratch that. The state's total indirect footprint, meaning capital inside networks with state equity, expanded dramatically from 61% to a staggering 85%. So they've decentralized the direct ownership while vastly expanding their indirect, networked influence across the entire economy.
But, as you might guess, this networked approach comes with a pretty heavy cost. As the IMF pointed out, value added per unit of fixed assets is nearly 40% lower for state-owned enterprises than private firms in identical sectors. 40%? So the crucial takeaway here is that funneling cheap capital into these less efficient, state-linked networks actually starves the highly productive private firms. It just fuels destructive industrial overcapacity, creating crowded sectors that do nothing but slash prices and burn through cash.
Section 4. Shielding the private sector. Despite all this expansion of state capital, Beijing knows full well that it needs private enterprise to survive. After all, the domestic private sector generates 60% of GDP and a massive 80% of urban jobs. This tricky balancing act is perfectly captured in an ideology known as the two unshakables. It essentially mandates that they must unshakably consolidate the public sector while also unshakably supporting the non-public economy. It really highlights the deep structural caution Beijing maintains. They see the state economy as the unshakable bedrock of the system, for sure, but they acutely recognize the vital necessity of private enterprise to keep the engine running and people employed.
And that structural caution is exactly what paved the way for the Private Economy Promotion Law, which takes effect in May 2025. After years of intense regulatory crackdowns that really rattled business confidence, this law was designed to reassure entrepreneurs. It guarantees equal policy eligibility, prohibits retroactive administrative guidelines, and amazingly, it even codifies personal sanctions for officials who unlawfully burden private firms. Though it's worth noting, legal scholars point out it still lacks strict enforceable mechanisms for government accountability. So it serves a bit more as a very strong political signal rather than a fundamental recalibration of power.
Section 5. The 15th Five-Year Plan.
Okay, so all of these mechanics we've talked about, the massive debt restructuring, the centralized control, the networked capital, and the private sector protections, they all culminate right here. Approved in March 2026, the 15th Five-Year Plan represents a deliberate, massive macroeconomic reorientation. In the 14th plan, they targeted GDP growth of around 5%, fueled by traditional industrial upgrading. But the new 15th plan accepts a deliberately lower GDP target of 4.5 to 5.0%. Why? Well, because they're finally shifting away from that debt-fueled infrastructure growth. Instead, they are entirely focused on technological self-reliance, building what they call new quality productive forces and pushing the digital economy's value added to 12.5% of GDP by 2030. It's a real game changer.
So where's all this money actually going? Well, the plan heavily targets what it calls industries of the future. We are talking about massive waves of state venture capital flowing into quantum technology, biomanufacturing, hydrogen and nuclear fusion power, embodied AI, and 6G communications. This isn't just about making cool tech. This is a highly targeted strategic move to ensure global leverage and build defensive resilience against any external supply chain shocks down the road.
And to manage this insanely complex transition without duplicating a ton of investments, the plan deploys these nationwide early warning systems. The sheer scale of this infrastructure is incredibly impressive. We're talking about advanced monitoring systems that integrate real-time data across macroeconomics, real estate, natural resources, labor, and the environment. Basically, it allows Beijing to precisely coordinate central interventions, prevent regional overproduction, and proactively shield the domestic economy from external geopolitical friction.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound final question to chew on. Can centralized control successfully engineer a high-tech future, or will structural debt ultimately hold it back? As international organizations like the IMF warn that deep, market-oriented reforms are absolutely essential, we really have to watch this space closely. Will this top-down rewiring of the machinery be enough to overcome the massive friction of China's structural imbalances? Or will the sheer weight of its own hidden debt slow the engine down? It's a massive rebalancing act, and one that is undoubtedly going to impact the entire global economy for decades to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.